Welcome to Dreamy History. Here's what makes no sense about the French Empire. For a nation so often defined by its internal struggles, its revolutionary fervour, and its relentless focus on continental dominance, France somehow managed to assemble one of the largest and most enduring colonial empires in human history. Think about it. This is the land of Joan of Arc, the Sun King, the Enlightenment, and the guillotine, all profoundly European, profoundly French concerns. Yet, at its zenith, the French tricolour flew over territories stretching from the Canadian Arctic to the searing deserts of North Africa, from the rice paddies of Indochina to the volcanic islands of the Pacific. How did a kingdom, and later a republic so consumed by its own borders and its immediate neighbours, managed to project its power across vast oceans, creating a global network of trade, settlement, and often brutal exploitation? It's a story riddled with paradoxes, a nation preaching liberty, equality, and fraternity, while simultaneously imposing its will on millions who had neither. A country that often seemed to bumble into its imperial acquisitions, only to defend them with ferocious tenacity. A history of grand designs often thwarted by internal strife, yet somehow always resurfacing with renewed ambition. The French Empire wasn't a single monolithic entity, but a series of distinct, often contradictory imperial projects, each shaped by its era, its leaders, and the ever-shifting tides of global power. It's a testament to both French resilience and its enduring, sometimes baffling capacity for self-reinvention. If you're enjoying this journey through history, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And I'm always curious. Drop a comment letting me know what city and time zone you're watching from. There's something special about knowing this story is reaching people all over the world. Let's start with the obvious question nobody asks about the French Empire. It didn't begin with grand visions of global domination or royal decrees charting vast new territories. It began with fish. Long before any French king seriously contemplated overseas colonies, Breton and Norman fishermen were already braving the treacherous North Atlantic, seeking the abundant cod banks off the coast of what we now call Newfoundland. By the late 15th century, these hardy mariners were making regular dangerous voyages, their small sturdy vessels, the floits and caravels, navigating storms and icebergs, all for the lucrative catches that fed a continent hungry for salted fish. This established a critical, if informal, French presence across the ocean, a practical economic venture that laid the very first, almost accidental groundwork for something far larger. While Spain and Portugal, armed with papal bulls and the Treaty of Tordesillas from 1494, were carving up the known and unknown worlds, France found itself largely excluded from the grand lottery of discovery. King Francis I, a flamboyant and ambitious monarch, famously scoffed at this arrangement, declaring, "Show me the clause in Adam's will that divides the world between Spain and Portugal." He recognized that access to new trade routes and potential riches was essential for France to compete with its Iberian rivals. This wasn't about spreading French culture or establishing a vast network of settlements just yet. It was about national prestige, economic opportunity, and a direct challenge to the burgeoning monopolies of Madrid and Lisbon. The stage was set, not for empire, but for exploration. Francis I's initial move was to sponsor Giovanni da Verrazzano, a Florentine navigator in 1524, Verrazzano's mission was to find a northwest passage to Asia, sailing north of the Spanish claims. He meticulously mapped the North American coastline from what is now North Carolina all the way up to Newfoundland, naming this vast unexplored land Nouvelle Angoulême, after the king's birthplace. While he didn't find the passage or any immediate gold, Verrazzano's voyage was a crucial act of assertion. It gave France a cartographic claim to a significant portion of North America, a claim built on the simple act of observation and naming. It was a subtle, almost academic, start to an empire. A decade later, in 1534, Francis I dispatched Jacques Cartier, a seasoned mariner from Saint-Malo, to continue the search for riches and a passage to the east. Cartier's first voyage was relatively brief but significant. He explored the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Lawrence, encountering the Micmac people and planting a large cross at Gaspé, claiming the land for France. The following year, 1535, Cartier returned, sailing deeper into the St. Lawrence River, convinced it was the fabled passage. He reached a large fortified Iroquoian village called Stadacona, near present-day Quebec City, and continued upstream to Hochelaga, where modern Montreal now stands. There, from the summit of what he named Mont Royal, he gazed upon a vast, seemingly endless continent, a panorama of forests and rivers, but no clear path to China, and crucially, no glittering cities of gold. The sheer hardship of these early transatlantic voyages is difficult to overstate. Imagine being cooped up for months on a small wooden ship, battling scurvy that rotted teeth and gums, facing storms that could capsize your vessel in an instant, and the constant threat of starvation. Cartier's crew, for example, suffered terribly during their first winter in the Sainte. Lawrence trapped by ice, losing 25 men to scurvy before the local Iroquois shared their knowledge of a potent vitamin C-rich concoction made from bark and needles of the Aneda tree, likely white cedar. These expeditions were not glamorous adventures but brutal tests of endurance, where survival was often a matter of sheer luck and the unexpected generosity of indigenous peoples. Cartier's voyages were marked by complex, often strained interactions with the local Iroquoian communities. Initial trade gave way to suspicion, mistrust, and ultimately betrayal. During his second voyage, Cartier famously kidnapped Donnacona, the chief of Stadacona, along with several of his sons, bringing them back to France to tell tales of a land of riches. This act, driven by a desperate desire to impress the king and secure further funding, utterly poisoned relations, sowing seeds of resentment that would haunt future French attempts at colonization. The dream of easy gold, of a convenient passage to Asia, proved elusive. Cartier's third and final voyage in 1541, a more ambitious attempt to establish a permanent settlement with 500 colonists, also ended in failure, plagued by harsh winters, continued hostility from the Iroquois, and the realization that the gold and diamonds they found were nothing more than iron, pyrite, and quartz. Despite these immediate failures to establish a permanent foothold or discover vast wealth, Cartier's expeditions were far from meaningless. They provided France with invaluable geographical knowledge, mapping the St. Lawrence River and its potential as a gateway into the North American interior. The persistent presence of French fishermen in the Grand Banks also ensured a continuous, if unofficial, claim. However, The immediate aftermath of Cartier's efforts saw a significant pause in French imperial ambitions. The mid-16th century plunged France into a devastating series of internal religious conflicts, the wars of religion, which would consume the nation's resources and attention for decades. The dream of empire for the moment had to wait. But the seeds were sown, and the lessons learned, or not learned, would profoundly shape the next, more determined wave of French expansion across the Atlantic and beyond. We left our story with Jacques Cartier, a man whose ambition had outrun his luck, returning to France with fool's gold and diamonds that were nothing more than worthless quartz. His dream of a permanent settlement on the St. Lawrence, as Nouvelle France, had crumbled under the weight of harsh winters, scurvy, and the growing justifiable hostility of the indigenous peoples he had so gravely wronged. Chief Donnacona, kidnapped and taken to France, died there, a stark and tragic symbol of the early, brutal cost of European ambition. Think about it. France, a nation that would one day boast a global empire, had just seen its grandest early colonial venture end in abject failure. The St. Lawrence, a river that promised a route to Asia and untold riches, had instead delivered only hardship and disillusionment. What followed was a period of profound internal turmoil, a self-inflicted wound that would halt France's overseas ambitions for decades. We call it the French Wars of Religion, 1562 to 1598, a brutal, bloody and protracted conflict between Catholics and Huguenots, French Protestants, that tore the very fabric of the nation apart. It's a powerful reminder that history is rarely a straight line, especially not the history of empire. How could a nation, so consumed by its own civil strife, a conflict that saw massacres like St. Bartholomew's Day in 1572, where thousands of Huguenots were slaughtered, possibly dedicate resources, men, or even coherent thought to building an empire across a vast ocean? It couldn't. The paradox deepens. The future colonial giant was for nearly 40 years too busy fighting itself to conquer anyone else. But empires, like phoenixes, have a way of rising from the ashes, often when you least expect it. The end of the Wars of Religion brought a new monarch to the throne, a man of remarkable pragmatism and vision, Henry IV, a former Huguenot who famously converted to Catholicism, quote, to secure the crown. Henry understood that national unity and economic prosperity were paramount. He issued the Edict of Nantes in 1598, granting substantial rights to Protestants and finally, bringing an end to the decades of bloodshed. With internal peace came the possibility once again of looking outward. So the question shifts from quote 5 to quote 6. The lessons from Cartier's failures were stark. No immediate gold, no easy northwest passage, and a very real need to understand and respect, or at least manage, indigenous populations. But the lure of the New World remained. The Spanish and Portuguese were still raking in riches from their American empires, and the English and Dutch were beginning to challenge their monopolies. France, proud and ambitious, could not afford to be left behind. The motivation was no longer just mythical gold, it was trade, prestige, and the assertion of French power on the global stage. The return to North America, however, didn't begin with another grand state-sponsored expedition. It began, as it so often did with France, with a more pragmatic, almost accidental step, the fur trade. Those hardy Breton and Norman fishermen, who never really stopped sailing to the Grand Banks, had also begun to trade with indigenous peoples along the coast. They discovered a commodity as valuable as gold in Europe's eyes: beaver pelts, prized for making fashionable felt hats. This wasn't the stuff of royal decrees and grand visions. It was the gritty, dangerous work of merchants and adventurers. One such adventurer was Pierre de Gaulle, Sieur de Mons, a French nobleman and entrepreneur. De Mons was granted a monopoly on the fur trade in a vast territory he called Acadia, a region encompassing present-day Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and parts of Maine. In 1604, he led an expedition to establish a permanent settlement, bringing with him a diverse group of colonists, including merchants, artisans, and a map-maker who would become legendary, Samuel de Champlain. Their first attempt was on a small island in the St. Croix River, on the present-day Maine-New Brunswick border. Think about the sheer audacity, the raw courage, or perhaps foolhardiness required for these ventures. They built dwellings, a storehouse, and a small fort. But like Cartier's men before them, they were utterly unprepared for the brutal North American winter. Ice choked the river, cutting them off from the mainland and fresh water. Scurvy, that dreaded scourge of early exploration, returned with a vengeance. 35 of the 79 men died. It was a grim, almost predictable echo of Cartier's ordeal, a testament to how slowly European colonists learned the brutal lessons of the land. The following spring they wisely relocated to a more sheltered spot across the Bay of Fundy, establishing Port Royal, near modern-day Annapolis Royal, Nova Scotia. This time, they learned. They cultivated gardens, forged better relations with the local Mi'kmaq people, who, crucially, taught them once again about local plants and game, and built a more sustainable community. Port Royal, though it faced its own struggles and would be temporarily abandoned and re-established multiple times due to English raids and political machinations, marked a critical turning point. It was France's first enduring settlement in North America. It wasn't glorious, it wasn't profitable in the way Spain's gold mines were, but it persisted. But the true heart of New France, the place that would define its character and destiny, would lie further north, back on the St. Lawrence River, the very river that had once broken Cartier's spirit, and it would be Samuel de Champlain, the meticulous cartographer and visionary leader, who would plant that seed. Champlain was no mere adventurer. He was a keen observer, a skilled navigator, and a remarkable diplomat. He had accompanied de Mons to Acadia, learning invaluable lessons about survival, indigenous relations, and the realities of colonial life. He understood that the fur trade was the economic engine, but he also harboured a grander vision, a permanent self-sustaining colony, a Nouvelle France that would rival the English and Spanish. In 1608, Champlain sailed up the St. Lawrence River, past the ghost of Cartier's failed settlement at Cap Rouge, and chose a strategic, defensible bluff overlooking the narrows of the river. He called it Quebec, an Algonquin word meaning where the river narrows. Here he founded Quebec City. This was not an easy undertaking. The first winter at Quebec was predictably horrific. Scurvy again had decimated the small group of 28 men. Only 8 survived. It's hard to imagine the sheer tenacity required to face such odds year after year in a remote wilderness. But Champlain was driven by an unshakable belief in the potential of this land. He didn't just survive, he mapped, he explored, and most importantly, he built relationships. Champlain understood, unlike Cartier, that success in this vast new land depended absolutely on forging strong alliances with the indigenous peoples. He cultivated relationships with the Montagnais, the Algonquian, and crucially, the Huron, powerful trading partners and fierce warriors. These alliances were not born purely of altruism, they were strategic necessities. The Huron, for example, controlled vast networks of fur trade routes extending deep into the continent. Forging an alliance with them meant access to those furs, but it also meant becoming embroiled in their long-standing conflicts. This is where the story of New France takes a definitive turn, setting it apart from its English counterparts to the south. In 1609, Champlain, alongside his Algonquian and Montagnais allies, engaged in a battle against their traditional enemies, the Iroquois, near what is now Ticonderoga, New York. Champlain, armed with an arquebus, a primitive firearm, personally killed several Iroquois chiefs, routing their forces. This act, while securing his alliances with the Huron and Algonquian, simultaneously cemented a deep and lasting enmity with the Iroquois Confederacy, an enmity that would shape the geopolitical landscape of northeastern North America for the next century and beyond. Think about the long-term implications of this single decision. It bound New France inextricably to the fate of its indigenous allies, drawing it into a complex web of intertribal warfare. It meant that French colonists, unlike many English settlers who often sought to push indigenous peoples off their lands, would live in closer proximity and interdependence with their indigenous neighbours. Their survival, their trade, even their very identity as Canadians would be forged in these complex, often violent, but undeniably intimate relationships. Champlain's vision for New France was not just about the fur trade, though that was its economic bedrock. He envisioned a society built on agricultural settlement, evangelization, bringing Catholicism to the indigenous peoples, and exploration, always pushing further, seeking that elusive route to Asia, mapping the vast interior. He was a man of relentless curiosity and tireless effort, making numerous voyages back and forth across the Atlantic, lobbying the French crown for support, and personally leading expeditions deep into the continent, even venturing as far as Lake Huron. By the time of his death in 1635, Champlain had laid the enduring foundation of New France. It was a fragile colony, perpetually underpopulated, struggling against harsh elements, and constantly threatened by disease and warfare. But it was there. It was a testament not to a grand, top-down imperial design, but to the extraordinary grit of individuals like Champlain, the economic pull of beaver pelts, and the complex, often violent, but utterly essential relationships forged with indigenous nations. The French Empire in North America was not born of gold and glory, but of furs, alliances, and an indomitable will to survive in a land that had, time and again, proven itself unforgiving. The lessons from Cartier's failures were slowly being learned, but the price of empire, in lives, in cultural clashes, and in endless struggle, was still being paid and would continue to be paid for centuries to come. Champlain was gone, the architect of a fragile peace, the visionary who saw beyond mere pelts to a true French imperium in the Americas, had passed in 1635, and with his death, The tenuous balance he had so painstakingly maintained threatened to unravel entirely. We're talking about New France teetering on the brink, a mere scattering of outposts. Quebec, Trois-Rivières, a few trading posts, clinging to the St. Lawrence like barnacles to a storm-tossed hull. Think about it. A few thousand souls, isolated, vulnerable, surrounded by vast unknown wilderness, and more immediately by an ancient, formidable enemy. Because Champlain's alliances, while strategically brilliant, had come with a price, hadn't they? His decision to fight alongside the Montagnais, Algonquian and Huron against the Iroquois Confederacy in 1609 wasn't just a skirmish, it was a declaration. It forged indispensable friendships, yes, but it also cemented an enmity so profound, so enduring, that it would define the very existence of New France for over a century. And in the wake of Champlain, that enmity exploded. Welcome to the Beaver Wars, an era less about exploration and more about sheer, brutal survival. If you thought Cartier's scurvy-ridden winters were tough, imagine living every single day under the shadow of lightning-fast raids, the piercing war cries, the constant threat of ambush. This wasn't just a border dispute. It was an existential struggle for the French, and a strategic, brutal campaign by the Iroquois to dominate the fur trade and secure their own survival against European diseases and encroaching settlements. The Iroquois, a confederacy of 5, later 6 powerful nations, Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca, were not some disorganized rabble. Far from it. They were masters of guerrilla warfare, shrewd strategists, and driven by a relentless need to replenish their ranks decimated by disease and to control the immensely lucrative beaver pelts that fueled European fashion. Their own hunting grounds were depleted, and the French, allied with the Huron to the west, effectively blocked their access to richer trapping territories. So, what did they do? They went to war. A war of attrition, a war of terror, designed to break the will of their enemies, both indigenous and European. New France, still primarily a fur trading venture, depended entirely on its indigenous allies to bring pelts to the trading posts. The Iroquois understood this perfectly. Their strategy was simple, elegant, and devastating. Cut off the supply lines. They ambushed Huron canoes laden with furs, raided French settlements, and systematically attacked and dispersed the very indigenous nations allied with the French. The Huron Confederacy, a powerful and sophisticated nation that had been crucial French partners, bore the brunt of these attacks. By the late 1640s and early 1650s, after years of relentless warfare, disease, and the fracturing of their traditional territories, the Huron Confederacy was effectively shattered. Think about the ripple effect. France loses its primary trading partners, its main source of furs, and a critical buffer against the Iroquois. It was a disaster, but hardship, as we've seen, often brings out the unique character of the French colonial endeavour. In this crucible, two distinct yet intertwined forces emerged: the unwavering zeal of the Catholic Church and the rugged independence of the coureurs des bois. Let's talk about the Jesuits. If Champlain laid the political and economic groundwork, the Jesuits sought to lay the spiritual. They arrived with a fervour that bordered on obsession, driven by the Counter-Reformation spirit to convert indigenous souls to Catholicism. These weren't just priests, they were explorers, linguists, ethnographers, and often martyrs. Their annual Jesuit relations are detailed letters and reports sent back to France are an invaluable, if sometimes biased, window into the daily life, struggles, and interactions of early New France. They documented everything: the weather, the customs of indigenous peoples, the horrors of disease, and of course, the brutal effectiveness of the Iroquois. Many perished at the hands of the Iroquois, enduring unimaginable torture and death. Yet their resolve never wavered. Their missions, often deep in indigenous territory, became outposts of French influence, sometimes even diplomatic centres, though their primary goal remained spiritual conversion. They were, in essence, the cultural vanguard of the French Empire in North America, pushing its spiritual boundaries even as its physical ones were under siege. Then there were the coureurs des bois. Quote 8. These were French Canadians who, frustrated by the Iroquois blockade and the limitations of settled life, struck out into the wilderness themselves. They learned indigenous languages, adopted their ways of travel, dress, and survival, and lived for months, even years, among various indigenous nations. They were the ultimate cultural intermediaries, blurring the lines between European and indigenous societies. They paddled canoes thousands of miles, established vast trading networks, and extended French influence and claims far beyond the tiny settlements. But they were also often viewed with suspicion by colonial authorities, unruly, independent, and sometimes perceived as challenging the very European order the colony was meant to impose. Yet without them, New France's fur trade would have utterly collapsed. They were the indispensable, unofficial backbone of the empire's economic engine, embodying the rugged individualism born of the North American wilderness. Consider the paradox here. France, a nation obsessed with order, hierarchy, and Catholic orthodoxy, was sustained in its North American colony by men who often eschewed all three. In the midst of this chaos, a new audacious project began: the founding of Ville-Marie, future Montreal, in 1642. This wasn't a pragmatic trading post like Quebec. It was a missionary utopian dream, a city of Mary, dedicated to the conversion of indigenous peoples and the spiritual purification of the French settlers. Led by figures like Paul de Chaumedet, de Maisonneuve, and Jeanne Mance, a nurse who founded the Hôtel Dieu Hospital, Ville-Marie was an act of profound faith and incredible bravery. It was also a direct challenge to the Iroquois, situated right on their traditional hunting and raiding routes. For decades, life in Montreal was a constant state of siege, a testament to the iron will of its founders and the enduring threat they faced. This brings us to the core problem of New France: population. Despite the heroics, the Jesuit zeal, and the grit of the coureurs des bois, the colony simply wasn't growing. France, unlike England, didn't have a surplus population eager to emigrate. Its peasants were largely tied to the land, its economy relatively stable, and the lure of a harsh, dangerous life across the Atlantic simply wasn't strong enough. By the 1660s, after decades of Iroquois wars, disease, and slow natural growth, the population of New France barely topped 3,000 French settlers. 3,000! Compared to the rapidly expanding English colonies to the south, which boasted tens of thousands, this was a demographic catastrophe. How could such a tiny, beleaguered outpost ever hope to defend itself, let alone expand its empire? The answer, or at least the beginning of one, came from the heart of France itself. King Louis XIV, the quote 11, and his brilliant finance minister Jean-Baptiste Colbert were not about to let this struggling colony simply wither away. They recognized the strategic value of New France, its furs, its potential as a base against the English, and its sheer prestige. The year 1663 marks a pivotal turning point. Louis XIV declared New France a royal province. This wasn't just a bureaucratic change, it was a fundamental shift in strategy. The era of haphazard company rule, where profits often trumped settlement, was over. Now the full might and resources of the French crown would be directed towards securing and developing the colony. Colbert, a man obsessed with order and economic efficiency, implemented a series of ambitious policies. First, he dispatched the formidable Carignan-Salieres regiment, over 1,200 professional soldiers, to New France. Their mission was clear: crush the Iroquois threat once and for all. And they did, launching devastating raids deep into Iroquois territory, burning villages and food stores. This military intervention finally brought a measure of peace, forcing the Iroquois to the negotiating table after decades of relentless warfare. But military security was only half the battle. The population problem remained. Colbert's solution was both pragmatic and profoundly impactful: the Filles du Roi, or King's Daughters. Between 1663 and 1673, nearly 800 young women, mostly orphans or from poor families, were sent to New France, their passage and dowries paid by the crown. Think about the audacity, the sheer social engineering of it all. These women were expected to marry quickly, often within weeks of arrival, and to have as many children as possible, and they did. The state even offered financial incentives for large families. It was a deliberate, systematic effort to populate the colony, and it worked. The birth rate soared, and the population of New France began to grow exponentially, laying the demographic foundation for French Canada. This royal intervention fundamentally reshaped New France. It brought stability, security, and a much-needed population boost. It also solidified the colony's unique character, a deeply Catholic, agriculturally based society, at least in the settled areas, still reliant on the fur trade for its economic vitality, and forever marked by its intricate, often violent relationship with indigenous peoples. The crucible of the Beaver Wars, the relentless zeal of the Jesuits, the independent spirit of the coureurs des bois, and the deliberate hand of the Sun King had forged a colony unlike any other. But this new, more secure New France was also about to find itself on a collision course with another burgeoning imperial power to the south, the English. The stage was set for a much larger global struggle for dominance in North America. So by the mid-17th century, France had finally, emphatically, laid its claim in North America. No more half measures or abandoned settlements. New France, a royal province forged in the crucible of Jesuit zeal, fur trade ambition, and the brutal reality of the Iroquois Wars, was finally stable. It was a unique society, isn't it? Deeply Catholic, agricultural in its core, yet economically tethered to the vast wild fur trade, and intricately, irrevocably bound to its indigenous relationships, both allies and enemies. This was France's foothold, a long thin crescent stretching from the Gulf of St. Lawrence down the Mississippi. But it was also a fortress, ready for the inevitable clash. And what was that clash? Well, to understand the French Empire from this point onward, you have to understand its primary antagonist, Great Britain, or more accurately the burgeoning English colonies to the south, which would soon coalesce into something far more unified and menacing. This wasn't just a squabble over land, it was a fundamental clash of imperial philosophies, economic models and sheer demographics. Think about it. New France, with its royal oversight, its emphasis on military protection, and its slow, deliberate growth, was a stark contrast to the rapidly expanding, relatively autonomous English colonies. The English were a demographic juggernaut, pushing westward, clearing land, and establishing dense agricultural settlements. The French, for all their vast territorial claims, were spread thin, focused on trade networks and strategic outposts rather than mass settlement. This demographic imbalance, this fundamental difference in how they used the land, would define the next century of conflict. The peace secured by the Carignan-Salière regiment was, of course, a temporary truce, a lull before the storm. Europe, ever the hotbed of dynastic squabbles and power plays, was about to drag its colonies into a series of global wars. These weren't just European wars with colonial sideshows. They were global wars, fought in the frozen forests of Canada, the sun-baked sugar fields of the Caribbean, and the distant trading posts of India. For the French Empire, North America and the Caribbean would become the primary theatres of this grand, bloody drama. The first major act opened with what the British called King William's War, 1689 to 1697, an extension of the War of the Grand Alliance in Europe. In North America it was a brutal affair of raids and counter-raids, often involving indigenous allies on both sides. The French, under the wily Governor Frontenac, proved adept at leveraging their indigenous partnerships, launching devastating attacks on English frontier settlements like Schenectady. But these were skirmishes, not decisive battles. The Treaty of Ryswick, which ended the war, essentially returned everything to its pre-war status. A temporary reprieve, nothing more. Then came the War of the Spanish Succession, 1701 to 1714, known in North America as Queen Anne's War. This was different. This was where France truly began to feel the squeeze. The English, now increasingly confident and determined, set their sights on Acadia, that crucial wedge of land encompassing modern-day Nova Scotia and parts of New Brunswick. Acadia was strategically vital, controlling access to the St. Lawrence River and serving as a base for the lucrative cod fisheries. Its inhabitants, the Acadians, were French-speaking Catholics, a distinct community who had carved out a life in the rugged maritime landscape. In 1710, a combined British and New England force captured Port Royal, the Acadian capital, renaming it Annapolis Royal. This was a significant blow, a harbinger of things to come. The Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, which ended the war, formalised the loss. France ceded Acadia, renamed Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, and the Hudson Bay Territory to Great Britain. Think about the implications. Newfoundland, the very place where those intrepid Breton and Norman fishermen had first planted an informal French flag centuries ago, was now officially British. It was a stripping away of France's early informal imperial claims, a stark reminder of the escalating stakes. The loss of Acadia was a bitter pill, but France, ever resilient, responded with characteristic ambition. To protect the vital St. Lawrence River and its access to the Grand Banks fisheries, they embarked on an audacious project. the construction of the fortress of Louisbourg on Cape Breton Island. This wasn't just a fort, it was a massive state-of-the-art military and naval base. A quote 14 designed to be impregnable. It cost a fortune, required immense effort, and became a symbol of French determination to hold on to what remained of their North American empire. It was a testament to their strategic thinking, yes, but also a monumental drain on resources that would prove, ultimately, to be a vulnerable, isolated outpost. Meanwhile, even as the empire contracted in the North Atlantic, it was expanding dramatically in the vast interior of North America. The coureurs des bois, those rugged, independent fur traders, continued to push the boundaries of French influence, establishing trading posts and building relationships with indigenous nations deep into the continent. This wasn't official conquest, not always, but a pervasive economic and cultural penetration. They were the sinews of a new kind of empire, one built on trade and alliance rather than dense settlement. This expansion led inevitably to the Mississippi Valley. Robert Cavalier de La Salle, a man of grand vision and often disastrous execution, explored the entire length of the Mississippi River in 1682, claiming the vast territory for King Louis XIV and naming it Louisiana. Think about the audacity, claiming a territory so immense, so utterly unknown in its interior, based on a river voyage. It was a declaration of intent, a strategic move to hem in the English colonies and secure a vast, fertile hinterland. The actual colonization of Louisiana, however, proved challenging. It was hot, humid, disease-ridden, and far from the established lines of supply. But in 1718, Jean-Baptiste Le Moyne de Bienville founded New Orleans, a crucial port city near the mouth of the Mississippi. This city, with its unique blend of French, Spanish, and African influences, would become the jewel of French Louisiana, a vital link in the chain of forts and trading posts stretching north to Canada. But even this ambitious expansion came with its own brand of chaos and grand failure. The early 18th century saw the infamous Mississippi Bubble in France. John Law, a Scottish financier, convinced the French government to grant his Compagnie d'Occident, later the Compagnie des Indes, a monopoly over trade in Louisiana and Canada. He promised immense riches, fueled by speculation and the issuance of paper money. The result was a spectacular boom and an even more spectacular bust, a financial meltdown that ruined countless investors. Yet, paradoxically, the Mississippi Bubble did spur some immigration to Louisiana, as desperate or hopeful individuals sought new lives in the New World, even if many found only hardship. While North America was a theatre of grand strategy, fur and frontier warfare, France's most economically valuable imperial possessions lay elsewhere, in the sun-drenched, disease-ridden islands of the Caribbean. These were the true cash cows of the French Empire. We're talking about sugar, coffee, indigo, and cotton, commodities that fueled European appetites and enriched French merchants and planters beyond measure. The crown jewel was Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti, a brutally efficient sugar colony that, by the late 18th century, would become the wealthiest colony in the world. Martinique and Guadeloupe were also immensely profitable. Think about the sheer scale of the operation. Vast plantations, worked by hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans, producing mountains of sugar that were then shipped back to France. This was an empire built on the most brutal form of human exploitation. a system designed to extract maximum profit at an unimaginable human cost. The paradox here is stark, isn't it? A nation that would later champion liberty, equality, fraternity was simultaneously presiding over one of the most oppressive slave systems in history. These Caribbean islands were small, but their economic weight was enormous. They were so valuable, in fact, that during the wars of the 18th century, European powers often preferred to capture a sugar island than a vast, sparsely populated chunk of North America. It was a constant strategic calculus. North America for prestige and future potential, the Caribbean for immediate immense wealth. And let's not forget the truly global reach, however nascent. France also maintained trading posts, comptoirs, in India, most notably Pondicherry, where they vied with the British East India Company for control of the subcontinent's lucrative trade in textiles, spices, and other goods. In West Africa, particularly Senegal, they established trading posts for gum arabic, gold, and tragically as a node in the transatlantic slave trade. This wasn't an empire of contiguous land masses, it was a network, a collection of strategic points, trading hubs, and resource extraction zones scattered across the globe. So, by the mid-18th century, the French Empire was a sprawling, multifaceted entity. In North America, it was a vast, thinly populated crescent of forts, trading posts, and mission settlements, constantly at odds with the more numerous and aggressive British colonies, and always reliant on complex indigenous alliances. In the Caribbean, it was a cluster of immensely wealthy, brutally exploited sugar islands. In India and Africa, it was a collection of trading outposts. This patchwork empire, this collection of often disparate projects, was now on a collision course. The long period of Anglo-French rivalry, punctuated by treaty and temporary peace, was about to culminate in a final decisive showdown. The stage was set for a truly global conflict, one that would determine the fate of not just New France, but the very balance of power across continents. The French, for all their strategic brilliance and military prowess, were about to face their greatest test against an opponent whose demographic and naval superiority would prove increasingly difficult to overcome. The Great Game, as it was sometimes called, was about to enter its final, most devastating act. The Great Game, as we called it, wasn't just a metaphor for geopolitical manoeuvring. It was a slow, grinding escalation that had been simmering for decades, a conflict born from fundamentally different imperial philosophies. Think about it. France, with its vast, thinly populated claims stretching from the frozen north to the sun-baked Gulf, relied on a network of forts, a handful of agricultural settlements, and crucially, a complex web of indigenous alliances. Great Britain, on the other hand, boasted denser, more populous coastal colonies, fueled by a relentless drive for agricultural expansion and increasingly an undeniable naval supremacy. The stage was set for a final, decisive showdown, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. Global dominance. The flashpoint, as is so often the case in history, was a seemingly insignificant patch of land, the Ohio Valley. Both empires coveted this fertile crescent, a strategic gateway that promised control over the lucrative fur trade and a potential route west. French coureurs de bois had long roamed its forests, establishing trading posts, but the British, their population swelling, saw it as the next frontier for their ever-expanding settlements. It was, in essence, an unstoppable force meeting a very movable, yet deeply entrenched object. The first shots, the true beginning of the French and Indian War, as the North American theatre of the 7 Years' War is known, were fired not by seasoned generals, but by a young, ambitious Virginian militia officer named George Washington. In 1754, his ill-fated expedition to Fort Duquesne, a French stronghold at the confluence of the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers, where modern-day Pittsburgh now stands, ended in a humiliating surrender at Fort Necessity. It was a minor skirmish, yes, but it was the spark that ignited a continental inferno, an inferno that would spread across oceans and continents. France, already facing immense financial pressures from its European wars and the maintenance of a vast, sprawling empire, poured what resources it could into North America. The Marquis de Montcalm, a brilliant but ultimately tragic figure, was dispatched to command the French forces. He arrived with a daunting task: defend an immense territory with a comparatively tiny population and a limited number of regular troops, relying heavily on the courage of Canadian militias and the crucial, if sometimes fickle, support of indigenous allies. Montcalm understood the terrain, understood the guerrilla tactics of his Native American partners, and initially he found success. Consider the early years of the war. While the British stumbled, most notably with General Braddock's disastrous defeat in 1755, an ambush in the wilderness near Fort Duquesne that saw him fatally wounded, and his regular troops decimated by a combined force of French and indigenous warriors, Montcalm secured key victories. Fort Oswego fell in 1756, followed by Fort William Henry in 1757, a victory tragically marred by the massacre of retreating British and colonial troops by Montcalm's indigenous allies, an event that would forever stain his legacy and fuel British retaliatory fervour. These victories, however impressive, were temporary reprieves, mere drops in the bucket against the rising tide of British power. The tide began to turn with the ascension of William Pitt the Elder to effective leadership in the British government. Pitt, a man of singular vision and unyielding determination, understood that the war for empire would be won or lost at sea, and crucially in North America. He poured money, men, and naval resources into the colonial theatre, realizing that stripping France of its colonial possessions would cripple its global ambitions. His strategy was simple, yet devastatingly effective. Blockade French ports, prevent reinforcements and supplies from reaching New France, and systematically attack key French strongholds. The fortress of Louisbourg, that formidable Quote 18 guarding the St. Lawrence, was the first to fall in 1758 after a brutal siege. Its capture was a strategic masterstroke, opening the gateway to the heart of New France. That same year, the British finally took Fort Duquesne, renaming it Fort Pitt, a symbolic turning point that cemented British control over the Ohio Valley. But the true climax, the moment etched forever in the annals of imperial history, occurred in 1759. General James Wolfe, a young, audacious British commander, was tasked with taking Quebec City, the very heart and soul of New France. Quebec, perched atop its formidable cliffs overlooking the St. Lawrence, seemed impregnable. For months, Wolfe's forces bombarded the city, but Montcalm, ever the defender, held fast. Then, in a brilliant, daring, and utterly desperate gamble, Wolfe landed his troops under the cover of darkness, scaling the sheer cliffs to the Plains of Abraham, just outside the city walls. The battle that ensued on September 13th 1759, was short, brutal, and decisive. Montcalm, perhaps rashly, chose to meet the British in open battle, rather than waiting for reinforcements or relying on his established defences. The disciplined British volleys shattered the French lines. Both Montcalm and Wolfe were mortally wounded, a tragic poetic end to two commanders who had fought with such tenacity and courage. With Quebec City's fall, New France's fate was sealed. The following year, in 1760, Montreal, the last major French stronghold, surrendered. The dream of a vast French empire in North America, stretching from the Arctic to the Gulf, was effectively over. But the 7 Years' War wasn't just fought in the snows of Canada. It was a truly global conflict, raging across Europe, in India, and, crucially for France, in the Caribbean. While Montcalm fought valiantly in North America, French forces were also battling the British for control of lucrative sugar islands like Martinique and Guadeloupe, and struggling to maintain their trading posts in India against the rising power of the British East India Company. This multi-front war, coupled with Britain's naval dominance, stretched French resources to their absolute breaking point. The economic output of the Caribbean colonies, while immense, couldn't compensate for the strategic losses elsewhere or the drain on the French treasury. The inevitable consequence of this global struggle was the Treaty of Paris, signed in 1763. For France, it was a cataclysm. We were forced to cede almost all of our vast North American possessions to Great Britain. New France, that hard-won, culturally unique colony, was lost. Louisiana, that immense, vaguely defined territory stretching down the Mississippi, was secretly transferred to Spain in the Treaty of Fontainebleau in 1762 and confirmed in Paris as compensation for Spain's entry into the war on France's side and to prevent it from falling into British hands. France retained only a few fishing islands off Newfoundland, Saint-Pierre and Miquelon, and a handful of economically vital, though strategically vulnerable, sugar islands in the Caribbean, Martinique, Guadeloupe and Saint-Domingue. Our ambitions in India were largely curtailed, reduced to a few trading posts without any significant military presence. So, here's the paradox, the bitter irony of it all. France, the continental powerhouse, the nation that had so often dictated terms in Europe, had lost its vast, sprawling overseas empire. Why? It wasn't for lack of courage or strategic brilliance in individual battles. It was, in large part, due to a fundamental mismatch of resources, population, and strategic focus. Britain, an island nation, understood the power of its navy and the necessity of controlling the seas to project power globally. France, perpetually entangled in European conflicts, often saw its colonial ventures as secondary, a drain on resources that could be better spent on its continental army. The population disparity between the burgeoning British colonies and the sparse settlements of New France was simply insurmountable in the long run, and yet this wasn't truly the end of the French Empire, merely the end of its first grand North American iteration. The seeds of future imperial endeavours, and indeed, the seeds of future revolutions, were already being sown. The loss of North America, while devastating, would paradoxically free France from a costly, sprawling commitment, allowing it to regroup, to focus its energies elsewhere. And as for Great Britain, its victory, so total and seemingly absolute, would soon carry its own unforeseen consequences. For the British colonists, now free from the French threat, would begin to question their own allegiance to a distant crown, setting the stage for yet another revolutionary upheaval, an upheaval that France, in a twist of historical fate, would play a crucial, if ultimately self-destructive role in supporting. The empire was gone, yes, but the spirit of French global ambition, like a phoenix, was merely waiting for its next fiery rebirth. And so, in 1763, France lay stripped bare of its North American grandeur, its dreams of a continental empire shattered by the Treaty of Paris. We've seen the Alps, the vast swathes of green and blue that vanished, replaced by British red. It looked like utter defeat, a humiliation of the highest order. But here's the thing about history, especially the history of empires. Sometimes losing everything means you're vainly free to try something new, or perhaps to double down on what really matters. Because while the world mourned or celebrated the demise of New France, the French crown was quietly counting its blessings, or rather, its sugar cubes. What remained of France's empire after 1763, after all the continental squabbling and the bloody wars over distant snow-covered forests, were its most profitable jewels: the Caribbean sugar islands, Guadeloupe, Martinique, and above all, Saint-Domingue, the pearl of the Antilles. Think about it. France lost a territory larger than Europe, a land of firs and forests, strategic rivers and hardy settlers, and what did it get in return? The undisputed claim to a few islands, tiny specks on the map, that collectively generated more wealth than all of New France ever dreamed of. It's a stark, almost brutal economic lesson. The fur trade, while lucrative, was nothing compared to the insatiable European demand for sugar, coffee, and indigo. And these islands delivered, fueled by a system of unparalleled brutality. Saint-Domingue, in particular, was an engine of wealth. By the late 18th century, it was the richest colony in the world, supplying nearly 2/3 of Europe's tropical produce. Its ports hummed with activity, its plantations stretched as far as the eye could see, and its coffers overflowed with gold. But this immense prosperity came at an unimaginable cost. The sugar plantations were hell on earth, powered by the forced labour of hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans, worked to death under a system so cruel, so dehumanizing, that the average life expectancy for an enslaved person after arrival was barely a decade. We talk about empires and their grand designs, their flags and their explorers, but the true foundation of this particular imperial jewel was the lash, the chain, and the relentless, soul-crushing toil of human beings treated as mere commodities. This was the dark heart of the French Empire's second breath, its renewed focus after the North American debacle. So France, wounded but not broken, turned its gaze inward, nursing its pride and its remaining wealth. Louis XV, a king more interested in pleasure than policy, still felt the sting of defeat. His successor, Louis XVI, inherited not just a crown, but a mountain of debt and a deep, simmering resentment against Great Britain. And this resentment, this desire for revenge, would become the single most destructive force for the French monarchy, even as it paradoxically helped birth a new nation. Because across the Atlantic, those very British colonies that had been the prize of the 7 Years' War were now chafing under the very imperial rule they had helped Britain secure. Quote, 19. They cried, echoing sentiments that had, ironically, been ignored in France's own colonies for centuries. The American Revolution was brewing, and France, seeing an opportunity for a delicious, long-awaited payback, began to watch with keen interest. At first, it was covert aid, money, arms, supplies, funneled through secret channels. But as the American cause gained momentum, particularly after the stunning victory at Saratoga in 1777, France decided to go all in. Here was a chance to humble Britain, to strip it of its own colonial empire and to restore some of France's lost prestige. What could go wrong? Well, a lot, as it turned out. In 1778, France formally recognized the United States and signed a treaty of alliance. We sent ships, soldiers, and our finest generals, including the young, idealistic Marquis de Lafayette, who became a hero in America, fighting alongside George Washington. French gold flowed across the Atlantic, funding a war that was not just about American independence, but also about a global power struggle between two old rivals. The Battle of Yorktown in 1781, the decisive victory that effectively ended the war, was a combined Franco-American effort, a testament to French naval and military might. The British surrendered and a new nation was born. France had its revenge. Britain was humbled. America was free. It was a triumph, a glorious moment for French diplomacy and military prowess. But at what cost? The American War of Independence, while a strategic victory for France, was a financial catastrophe. The French crown, already teetering on the brink of bankruptcy from generations of lavish spending and previous wars, plunged headlong into an abyss of debt. To fund the war effort, Louis XVI borrowed astronomical sums, mortgaging the future of his kingdom. The American ideals of liberty, equality, and popular sovereignty, which French soldiers and intellectuals had embraced, began to echo dangerously back across the ocean, inspiring a populace groaning under the weight of an archaic social structure and a crushing tax burden. This, dear reader, is where the paradox truly deepens. France, the champion of liberty abroad, was a bastion of absolutism and inequality at home, a society divided into rigid estates, clergy, nobility, and everyone else, where the vast majority bore the brunt of taxation and had no political voice. The Enlightenment, a powerful intellectual movement born in France, had championed reason, individual rights, and challenged the very foundations of divine right monarchy. Now these ideas, coupled with the stark reality of financial ruin, converged into a perfect storm. The year 1789 arrived, and with it the French Revolution. The Bastille fell, the monarchy crumbled, and the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen proclaimed universal liberty, equality, and fraternity. It was a seismic event, one that would reshape not just France but the entire world. And like a ripple effect, its ideals, its chaos, and its violence would inevitably crash upon the shores of France's remaining empire, particularly the jewel in its crown, Saint-Domingue. Think about it. The Declaration of the Rights of Man stated, "Men are born and remain free and equal in rights." How could France, the motherland of this revolutionary ideal, reconcile it with the brutal reality of hundreds of thousands of enslaved people toiling in its colonies? The cognitive dissonance was immense, unsustainable. The planters naturally wanted to maintain the status quo, fearing that any talk of liberty would ignite a powder keg. The gens de couleur libre, free people of colour, often wealthy and educated, demanded equal rights, pointing to their property, their military service, and their undeniable humanity. And below them, simmering with generations of rage and suffering, were the enslaved, watching, listening, waiting. The chaos of the revolution in France provided the perfect opportunity. In August 1791, the powder keg exploded. On the plains of the North Province of Saint-Domingue, a Vaudou ceremony at Bois-Caïman ignited a coordinated slave revolt, unprecedented in its scale and ferocity. Plantations burned, overseers were slaughtered, and the sugar economy, the very engine of French colonial wealth, ground to a halt. This was not just a rebellion, it was a revolution led by figures like Toussaint Louverture, a brilliant military strategist and political leader born into slavery who would become the architect of Haitian independence. The French Revolution, in its initial phases, struggled with the implications of this colonial uprising. The Jacobins, in their most radical phase, embraced the ideals of abolition, driven by both principle and a pragmatic desire to destabilize their British and Spanish rivals, who also had slave colonies. In 1794, the National Convention officially abolished slavery throughout the French Empire. It was a monumental revolutionary act, the first major European power to do so, and it briefly transformed the enslaved of Saint-Domingue into free French citizens, fighting for the Republic against foreign invaders. But the French Revolution was a whirlwind of shifting ideologies and power struggles. What was revolutionary one day could be counter-revolutionary the next. The initial euphoria of abolition was short-lived. France itself descended into the reign of terror, then the Directory, a period of instability and corruption. And out of this chaos, a new, formidable figure emerged: Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon, a military genius and an ambitious autocrat, brought order to France, but he also brought a distinctly different vision for the empire. He saw the colonies not as laboratories for revolutionary ideals, but as instruments of power and wealth. And he saw the abolition of slavery as a mistake, a sentimental folly that had cost France its most lucrative possession. He dreamed of restoring the sugar plantations, bringing Saint-Domingue back into the fold, and re-establishing the brutal system that had made it so rich. In 1802, Napoleon dispatched a massive expeditionary force, led by his brother-in-law Charles Leclerc, to Saint-Domingue with orders to crush the rebellion, capture Toussaint Louverture, and reinstate slavery. It was the largest overseas expedition France had ever mounted, a testament to how crucial Saint-Domingue was to Napoleon's imperial ambitions. The optics were horrifying. The very nation that had declared liberty and equality now sought to re-enslave a people who had fought for their freedom. The struggle was epic, brutal, and ultimately tragic for France. Toussaint Louverture was captured through treachery and died in a French prison in the Jura Mountains, a martyr to liberty. But the spirit of resistance did not die with him. Under the leadership of Jean-Jacques Dessalines, the Haitian revolutionaries fought with a ferocity born of desperation and a profound understanding of what they were fighting for. Yellow fever, the deadliest ally of the enslaved, decimated Leclerc's army, including Leclerc himself. The French forces, despite their superior training and equipment, found themselves bogged down in a guerrilla war against a determined, unified people. In a hostile tropical environment, Napoleon's grand plan crumbled. The dream of re-establishing slavery and restoring the sugar empire in Saint-Domingue became a nightmare. The cost in French lives and treasure was staggering. This failure in the Caribbean, coupled with his impending war with Great Britain, forced Napoleon to reconsider his entire North American strategy. If he couldn't hold Saint-Domingue, how could he possibly defend the vast, unwieldy territory of Louisiana, which France had secretly reacquired from Spain in 1800? The answer was simple. He couldn't. And so, in 1803, in a move that dramatically reshaped the map of North America and inadvertently helped fund his European wars, Napoleon made an offer to the young United States that they couldn't refuse. He sold the entire Louisiana territory for a paltry sum, effectively ending France's presence on the North American mainland for good. It was a pragmatic decision, born of military necessity and imperial failure in the Caribbean. The Haitian Revolution, a direct consequence of the French Revolution's ideals and subsequent betrayals, achieved its ultimate goal. On January 1st, 1804, Saint-Domingue declared its independence, becoming Haiti, the first free black republic, the first nation born of a successful slave revolt, and the only nation whose independence was won through such a struggle. It was a triumph of the human spirit against overwhelming odds, a testament to the enduring power of liberty, and a profound, permanent blow to the French colonial project. So, by the dawn of the 19th century, the French Empire, which had begun with dreams of gold and furs in North America, then shifted to the immense wealth of Caribbean sugar, found itself again dramatically reshaped. It had lost its mainland North American possessions twice over, and its most valuable colony had declared its own freedom at great cost to France. Napoleon, a man of boundless ambition, now stood at the helm, looking not to distant colonies, but to the very heart of Europe. The empire was about to enter its most audacious, most dominant, and ultimately most destructive phase, one that would redefine what it meant to be French and what it meant to conquer, having shed its North American burden, or perhaps more accurately, having had it ripped from its grasp by the twin forces of disease and rebellion. France, under Napoleon, turned its formidable gaze inward, or rather eastward, across the European continent. Our story, which began on the treacherous North Atlantic and struggled through the icy grip of Canadian winters, now briefly shifts to the grand battlefields of Europe. Think about it. A nation that had just lost its most valuable colonial possession, and its vast, albeit largely unpopulated, mainland North American claims, was simultaneously building an empire that stretched from the Iberian Peninsula to the plains of Russia. It's a paradox of scale, isn't it? France was never more dominant on its home continent, yet never more diminished overseas. Napoleon's continental empire was a spectacular, if fleeting, edifice built on military genius and revolutionary fervour. He rewrote maps, crowned kings, including himself, and reshaped European law. For a glorious, terrifying decade, French hegemony was undeniable. But this was an empire of conquest, not of colonization. It was about direct control, strategic alliances, and the imposition of a new order, not about distant settlements or the exploitation of raw materials from overseas territories in the same way the old colonial powers understood it, and like all empires built on the shifting sands of military success, it eventually collapsed. The snows of Russia, the combined might of European coalitions, and the relentless pressure of British naval power brought the Corsican Titan to his knees. By 1815, the Bourbon monarchy, in the person of Louis XVIII, was restored, and Europe gathered at the Congress of Vienna to pick through the wreckage and redraw the lines. This is where the first French colonial empire truly, unequivocally died. What little remained of France's overseas holdings after the 7 Years' War and the Napoleonic Wars was further whittled down. Britain, the undisputed naval power, scooped up Mauritius, Tobago, and St. Lucia, among others. France was left with a smattering of Caribbean islands, Guadeloupe, Martinique, some trading posts in West Africa, Senegal, a few islands in the Indian Ocean, Réunion, and its fishing rights off Newfoundland, a mere shadow of its former, already rather chaotic global reach. It was a humiliating moment for a nation that had so recently aspired to global dominion. But here's the thing about France. It's a nation that, despite its internal convulsions and external setbacks, possesses an almost uncanny ability to reinvent itself, to find new avenues for its ambitions. The Bourbon Restoration, 1815 to 1830, and the subsequent July Monarchy, 1830 to 1848, were periods of profound internal political instability, marked by a constant tug-of-war between royalists, liberals, and nascent republicans. Yet it was precisely during this era of domestic uncertainty that the seeds of France's second colonial empire began to sprout. Why? Why, when the nation was struggling to find its footing at home, would it again turn its attention to lands far away? Well, the reasons are as complex and contradictory as France itself. There was the lingering desire for national prestige, a yearning to reclaim a place among the great powers after the Napoleonic humiliation. There was the economic impulse, the need for new markets, new resources, and new avenues for trade, especially as industrialization began to take hold. And perhaps most importantly, there was the allure of distraction. What better way to unite a fractious populace, or to bolster a shaky throne, than with a glorious foreign adventure? This brings us to a pivotal moment, one that truly inaugurates the Second French colonial empire, the invasion of Algiers in 1830. For centuries the Barbary coast, a stretch of North Africa encompassing present-day Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia and Libya, had been a thorn in the side of European maritime powers, operating under the nominal suzerainty of the Ottoman Empire but largely independent. The various regencies engaged in privateering, euphemistically called piracy, by Europeans, and slave raiding, capturing ships and ransoming their crews and passengers. France, like other nations, had paid tribute to the Dey of Algiers for safe passage, a humiliating but pragmatic arrangement. The pretext for the invasion, however, was almost comically trivial. It's known as the fly whisk incident, or the fan incident. In 1827, during a heated discussion about an old unpaid debt owed by France for wheat, supplied to Napoleon's armies, the Dey of Algiers, Hussein, allegedly struck the French consul, Pierre de Val, with his fly whisk, or fan. An insult, an outrage, a clear violation of diplomatic immunity. Of course, the fly whisk was merely the spark. The underlying reasons were far deeper. King Charles X, the ultra-royalist monarch, was facing growing opposition at home. His increasingly authoritarian rule was unpopular, and he needed a victory, a grand gesture, to shore up his legitimacy and distract his critics. The opportunity to crush the Barbary pirates, reclaim French honour, and perhaps establish a new trading post seemed too good to pass up. So, in May 1830, a massive French expeditionary force, 37,000 soldiers, hundreds of ships, set sail from Toulon. It was an undertaking of Napoleonic scale, a testament to France's renewed military capabilities and its determination to project power beyond its borders. The landings near Algiers were successful, and after a brief, brutal campaign, the city fell on July 5, 1830. The Dey surrendered, his treasury was seized, and a new chapter in French colonial history, marked by violence and long-term entanglement, began. But the irony, the delicious historical irony, is almost too much to bear. Charles de got his victory, but it was too little, too late. Just weeks after the fall of Algiers, the July Revolution erupted in Paris. The very public he sought to impress, the very critics he aimed to silence, rose up against him. Charles VI was overthrown, and the citizen king Louis Philippe ascended to the throne, ushering in the July monarchy. The conquest of Algiers, intended to save a monarchy, instead became the final, desperate act of a dying regime. So, France had conquered Algiers. Now what? The initial plan was vague. Some within the new government considered withdrawing, seeing the occupation as an unnecessary drain on resources. But the momentum of conquest, the sheer effort involved, and the growing clamour from French settlers and military men who saw opportunity in the fertile Algerian plains made retreat difficult. The jewel of the North African coast, once taken, proved impossible to relinquish. What followed was a brutal, protracted pacification that lasted for decades. The French faced fierce resistance from various Algerian tribes and leaders, most notably Abd el-Kader, who would emerge as a formidable opponent and national hero. The early years of French rule in Algeria were characterized by a level of violence and destruction that shocked even contemporary observers. Scorched earth tactics, massacres, and the systematic destruction of villages and crops became hallmarks of the French conquest. This was not the relatively hands-off fur trade model of New France, nor the plantation economy of the Caribbean. This was a direct settler colonial project aimed at expropriating land, imposing French law and culture, and integrating Algeria directly into France. For the French, Algeria quickly became more than just a colony. It became a department of France, a direct extension of the metropole across the Mediterranean. This unique status would shape its history for well over a century, leading to a complex and often tragic relationship between colonizer and colonized. European settlers, encouraged by the French government, began to pour into Algeria, dreaming of new lives and fertile lands. These colons, or pieds noirs, as they would later be known, would eventually form a powerful lobby, cementing France's hold on the territory and making any future withdrawal almost unthinkable. While Algeria became the undisputed centerpiece of this nascent Second Empire, France also began to tentatively re-engage in other parts of the world. In West Africa, its old trading posts in Senegal were expanded, laying the groundwork for future territorial acquisitions. In the Pacific, French missionaries and naval officers began to assert influence, particularly in Tahiti and other Polynesian islands, driven by a mix of scientific curiosity, strategic competition with Britain, and a desire to spread Catholicism. These were smaller, less dramatic ventures than Algiers, but they signalled a clear shift in French foreign policy. The empire was back, not with the grand, chaotic sweep of its first iteration, but with a more deliberate, often brutal, and deeply nationalistic purpose. The lessons of North America, of the fur trade and its alliances, seem to have been forgotten, replaced by a new, harsher doctrine of direct conquest and assimilation. and the story of this new empire forged in the fires of Algerian resistance was just beginning. The invasion of Algiers in 1830, a mere fortnight before a new revolution toppled Charles de Gaulle, was more than just a punitive expedition. It was a declaration, a statement that France, despite its internal turmoil and the recent loss of its first grand empire, was back on the global stage. The fleet that sailed for Algiers was not just carrying soldiers, it carried the weight of national expectation, a desperate gamble by a monarch clinging to power, and the nascent ambition of a nation yearning for renewed prestige. The streets of Paris, still echoing with the ghosts of revolutions past, buzzed with a mix of apprehension and patriotic fervour. For many, this distant venture was a much-needed distraction, a tangible display of strength after years of continental retreat. But this quote 28 was a different beast entirely. Gone were the grand visions of settlement in frozen Canada, the attempts to replicate French society across the Atlantic with its rigid class structures and agrarian dreams. This new empire, born of industrial ambition and nationalistic fervour, was about raw resources, strategic points, and, above all, gloire, that elusive, all-consuming French prestige that fueled politicians and industrialists alike. Quote, 29. A minister might have murmured to himself, gazing at a map of the world. Quote, 30. From its ancient trading posts along the Senegal River, where French presence had flickered since the 17th century, France began pushing inland. These outposts, often little more than fortified trading factories with mud walls baking under the harsh sun, were bustling microcosms of colonial life. The air hung heavy with the scent of spices, dried fish, and the damp earth of the river banks, a constant reminder of the exotic and the unfamiliar. Here, European traders mingled with local merchants, their transactions a chaotic blend of pidgin French and indigenous languages. The motivations for expansion were manifold, yet always intertwined. Control of vital trade routes that snaked across the vast interior, access to valuable resources like peanuts, whose oil was increasingly sought after by European industries, the sticky, precious gum arabic used in everything from textiles to pharmaceuticals, and later, the burgeoning demand for rubber that would fuel the coming automotive age. Crucially, there was also the relentless desire to outmaneuver burgeoning British influence in West Africa, a constant shadow in the colonial competition. Think about it. Tiny pockets of French influence, often just forts or trading factories, became the launching pads for claims over vast unknown territories. Explorers, often military officers, ventured into the interior, driven by a mix of scientific curiosity, personal ambition, and unwavering national pride. Captain Henri Dubois, perhaps, trekking through dense bush, sweltering in his heavy uniform, might have felt the thrill of discovery pulse through him, a sense of being on the vanguard of civilization. Quote Chateautheur 1. He'd think, wiping sweat from his brow, "It will all bear the mark of France." He and his peers signed treaties, often under duress or misunderstanding, with local rulers, effectively laying claim to lands they barely comprehended, their signatures on paper grants that meant little to the indigenous leaders who saw them as temporary alliances, not permanent cessions of sovereignty. A chief, perhaps, offered a few trinkets or a bottle of brandy, would agree to a friendship pact, unaware that the document he marked with an X was ceding millions of acres to a distant European power. This wasn't just about West Africa, though. While the brutal, quote, 34 of Algeria continued for decades, costing countless lives on both sides in a relentless cycle of rebellion and repression, French ambition cast its net wider. In Central Africa, a naval officer named Pierre Savognin de Brazza, a name you might recognise, explored the vast Congo basin in the 1870s and 80s. The Congo, a realm of steaming jungles, mighty rivers, and immense biodiversity, presented both a challenge and an irresistible allure. Unlike some of his contemporaries, whose names became synonymous with ruthless conquest and violence, Brazza was celebrated for his relatively peaceful methods. He moved with a certain measured diplomacy, preferring dialogue and carefully orchestrated gift exchanges to immediate military confrontation. His expeditions often involved forging alliances with local rulers, explaining his intentions, or at least the version of them he wished to convey, and establishing French claims through negotiation rather than brute force. Yet even his, quote, 35 fes acquisitions were part of the larger imperial grab, setting the stage for the creation of French Congo, a territory whose rich resources from ivory to rubber would be ruthlessly exploited for decades to come, a stark testament to the ultimate outcome of even the most, quote, 36, quote, colonization. But Africa wasn't the only continent catching France's gaze. Far to the east, in the shimmering, fertile lands of Southeast Asia, another opportunity beckoned. Here, the pretext for intervention often involved the protection of Catholic missionaries, many of whom were French, facing persecution from local authorities in Vietnam. For a priest like Father Antoine, risking his life in a foreign land, the plight of his converts was a genuine humanitarian concern, a sacred duty. But for the strategists in Paris, this humanitarian concern, however genuine for some, often served as a convenient smokescreen for deeper geopolitical and economic interests. France, like other European powers, saw Southeast Asia as a crucial gateway to the fabled markets of China, a land of unimaginable wealth, and its fertile deltas promised lucrative cash crops like rice, spices, and later rubber, which would flow directly into French coffers. The process began with gradual incursions into Cochin China, the southernmost region of Vietnam, in the 1850s and 60s. It started with naval bombardments, the thunder of French cannons echoing across serene rice paddies, followed by swift troop landings that led to the seizure of key ports like Saigon. The city, once a bustling hub of local trade, quickly transformed under French administration. It wasn't a clean, swift conquest. It was a brutal, drawn-out affair, a testament to the fierce resistance of the Vietnamese people, who fought tenaciously against the technologically superior French forces. Guerrilla fighters, armed with antiquated muskets and a burning desire for independence, ambushed French patrols, melted into the dense jungle, and proved to be an elusive, persistent enemy. Yet, piece by agonizing piece, France chipped away at Vietnamese independence, eventually establishing a protectorate over Annam and Tonkin, central and northern Vietnam, and Cambodia, and later Laos. By the end of the century, these territories would be consolidated into the French Union of Indochina, an empire within an empire, a jewel in France's new imperial crown, sparkling with the promise of wealth, but stained by the blood of its acquisition. Meanwhile, in the vast blue expanse of the Pacific, France continued to dot the map with its presence. Building on earlier explorations, it formally annexed New Caledonia in 1853, transforming it into a penal colony and a source of nickel. The convicts, banished from France, toiled under a harsh sun, their dreams of freedom replaced by the grim reality of forced labour in a land so distant it felt like another world. Tahiti and other islands in what would become French Polynesia followed, acquired for their strategic value as coaling stations for an expanding global navy. These stations were crucial arteries for steam-powered ships, allowing them to refuel and extend their reach across vast oceans, projecting French power far from home. They were also symbols of French reach, little flags planted on remote atolls, about denying rivals crucial footholds in a world increasingly carved up by competing empires. The latter half of the 19th century saw what historians aptly call the scramble for Africa. It was a feverish, almost manic race, a continent-wide land grab driven by industrial demand, national pride, and a fear of being left behind. The advent of steamships allowed faster navigation of rivers and coasts, while quinine, a revolutionary medicine, finally offered protection against the deadly grip of malaria, which had long been the continent's most formidable defence. Superior weaponry, repeating rifles, Gatling guns, gave Europeans an overwhelming military advantage. With the major powers, Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, Portugal, Italy and Spain, all jostling for territory, the risk of armed conflict grew. To prevent this, and to formalise their claims, European diplomats gathered in Berlin in 1884 to 1885. Imagine the scene: elegant gentlemen in starched collars and silk cravats, gathered around large oak tables, their faces illuminated by gaslight, maps of Africa spread before them. With casual arrogance, they literally drew lines on a map, with little regard for the hundreds of distinct nations, cultures and languages already existing there, carving up a continent as if it were an empty pie. Quote 38. One delegate might have declared, a self-satisfied smirk playing on his lips, oblivious to the generations of conflict and suffering these arbitrary lines would unleash. France emerged from the Berlin Conference with a colossal share. From the Atlantic coast, across the vast Sahara Desert, and down into Central Africa, France carved out an empire larger than its European self by many magnitudes. French West Africa and French Equatorial Africa became immense, contiguous blocks of territory, often connected only by the flimsiest of administrative threads and the sheer force of French will. The borders were arbitrary, the claims often based on a single explorer's arduous journey or a dubious treaty. Yet they were recognised by the other European powers, solidifying France's place as a major colonial power, a source of immense pride back home. The justification for this colossal land grab, the quote 39, the civilizing mission. This was the grand, often self-serving, ideological framework. French imperialists argued that they were bringing civilization, progress, Christianity, and the benefits of French culture to quote 40 peoples. They believed they had a moral duty to uplift, to educate, to develop, to free these populations from what they perceived as superstition and savagery. Think about the irony. A nation that had overthrown its monarchy for quote 41 now imposing its will, often brutally, on millions deemed quote 42. How could they reconcile such a paradox? By convincing themselves that these quote 43 quote were not yet ready for true liberty, that they needed the firm, guiding hand of France. The very ideals that had fueled the French Revolution were twisted to rationalize domination. In practice, the mission civilisatrix often translated into direct rule, with French administrators overseeing local populations, their distant authority enforced by military garrisons. An assimilation policy sought to turn colonial subjects into, quote, 44, quote, or, quote, 45, quote, at least culturally, if never truly as equals. French language, French education, French law were imposed, often at the expense of indigenous languages and customs, seen as obstacles to progress. Economically, the colonies were seen as sources of raw materials and captive markets for French goods. Rubber plantations, mineral mines, cash crops like cotton, coffee and cocoa, all were developed, often with forced labour under brutal conditions and channelled back to the metropole, fueling French industry and enriching French merchants, while the indigenous populations often saw little benefit beyond the barest subsistence. But the narrative wasn't one of passive acceptance. From the deserts of Algeria to the jungles of Indochina and across the vast plains of West Africa, resistance simmered, flared, and was often brutally suppressed. Indigenous leaders, prophets and warriors rose up against the invaders, fighting for their ancestral lands, their cultures, and their freedom. Small-scale skirmishes, organised rebellions, and acts of quiet defiance became commonplace, met with overwhelming French military might and often horrific reprisals. The cost in human lives, both European and especially indigenous, was immense, a silent testament to the violence inherent in the colonial project. The French Empire, by the turn of the 20th century, was a vast, sprawling entity, built on a foundation of economic exploitation, cultural imposition, and military might. It was a testament to French ambition, but also a stark illustration of the profound contradictions inherent in a nation that championed liberty at home while denying it abroad. This stage was set for the 20th century, a century that would test the very foundations of this sprawling paradoxical empire and ultimately witness its dramatic unravelling. So, France had its empire, a sprawling, dizzying collection of territories acquired through a mix of strategic foresight, opportunistic land grabs, and often brutal conquest. By the turn of the 20th century, the Second French colonial empire was second only to Britain's in sheer geographical scale, stretching from the baking Sahara to the misty Mekong Delta, from the sun-drenched islands of the Pacific to the frigid North Atlantic fishing grounds. But possessing an empire, as we've seen, is one thing. Governing it, making it work, is an entirely different beast. How do you manage such a vast, disparate collection of peoples and lands, all while maintaining the illusion of French superiority and the promise of the mission civilisatrix? This, dear reader, was the monumental task facing Paris in the decades leading up to the Great War. It's a story of administrative ingenuity, certainly, but also one of profound contradiction and burgeoning resistance. The mission civilisatrix wasn't just a pretty slogan. It was the blueprint for governance, a justification for the often ruthless imposition of French will. The idea was to bring the, quote, 46 of French culture, language and administration to, quote, 47 peoples. But how did this play out on the ground? Broadly, France adopted two main approaches, assimilation and association. Assimilation, theoretically, aimed to turn colonial subjects into French citizens, fully integrated into French culture and society. Think of the Quatre Communes, 4 communes in Senegal, Dakar, Gorée, Rufisque, and Saint-Louis, whose inhabitants, remarkably, were granted full French citizenship and even the right to vote. It sounds progressive, doesn't it? A nation truly extending its ideals of liberty, equality, fraternity. But think about it. How many could truly assimilate? Very few. This was an exception, not the rule. For the vast majority, assimilation was a pipe dream, a carrot dangled tantalizingly out of reach, designed more to justify the colonial project than to genuinely uplift the colonized. It created a tiny elite, educated in French schools, who often found themselves alienated from their own cultures, yet never fully accepted as equals by the French metropole. It was a cruel paradox, encouraged to become French, but never truly allowed to be. Association, on the other hand, was a more pragmatic and often more cynical approach. It acknowledged the distinct cultures of the colonized peoples, but sought to associate them with French rule through local intermediaries, often traditional chiefs or leaders. This was the model largely applied in Indochina and much of French West Africa. France would rule indirectly, preserving certain local customs and institutions, but always with a French resident or governor-general pulling the strings behind the scenes. It was cheaper, less disruptive, and allowed France to leverage existing power structures, often exacerbating internal divisions for its own benefit. Both systems, however, shared a common goal: to extract resources and labour for the benefit of the metropole. And what resources they were! From the rubber and rice of Indochina, to the groundnuts and cotton of West Africa, from the phosphates of North Africa, to the timber of Central Africa, the empire was a vast larder for industrializing France. It was a one-way street, of course. Raw materials flowed to France, processed goods flowed back, often at inflated prices, ensuring a captive market. Infrastructure, railroads, ports, was built, but primarily to facilitate this extraction, not necessarily for the overall development of the local populations. Taxation was heavy, often levied in cash, forcing subsistence farmers into the cash economy, and sometimes into forced labour to meet their obligations. The notorious corvée system, or forced labour, was prevalent across the empire, particularly for large-scale infrastructure projects, leading to immense suffering and death tolls in places like the Congo. But beneath the veneer of colonial order, these seeds of dissent were already sprouting. The very act of imposing foreign rule, regardless of the administrative method, generated resistance. Sometimes it was overt, like the ongoing rebellions in Algeria that continued well into the early 20th century, or the numerous localized uprisings in West Africa and Indochina. More often, it was subtle, cultural preservation, quiet non-cooperation, the slow, simmering resentment that would eventually boil over. The exposure to French ideals of liberty and self-determination, ironic as it was, also provided the intellectual framework for future nationalist movements. Young colonial intellectuals, educated in Paris or colonial schools, absorbed these ideas and began to turn them against the colonial masters. As the storm clouds gathered over Europe in the early 20th century, France looked to its empire not just for prestige and resources, but for muscle. The looming threat of Germany meant that every available man, every available resource would be needed. This brings us to one of the most poignant and paradoxical chapters in the empire's history, its role in World War I. When the guns of August 1914 shattered the peace, France found itself in a desperate struggle for survival. And who did it turn to? Its colonial subjects. Millions of colonial subjects, from the scorching sands of North Africa to the lush deltas of Indochina, from the forests of sub-Saharan Africa to the distant islands, were conscripted, volunteered, or compelled to fight for a pays, quote, all 48. Many had never seen. Think about it. Senegalese tirailleurs, Moroccan goumiers, Algerian infantry, Indochinese labourers, Malagasy soldiers. They were all sent to the frozen muddy trenches of the Western Front. Charles Mangin, a French general, famously advocated for a Cairn quoti as 49. Force noire, believing African troops to be particularly suited for the brutal realities of trench warfare. It was a racist notion, of course, but it underscored the desperate need for manpower. These men fought with incredible bravery and suffered disproportionately high casualties. They endured the horrors of Verdun, the Somme, and countless other battles, often facing racial discrimination within the ranks and being assigned the most dangerous tasks. Their sacrifice was immense, their contribution undeniable. Beyond manpower, the empire provided crucial economic support. Colonial factories and farms ramped up production to supply the war effort. Indochina sent rice, rubber and labourers. West Africa supplied ground nuts, timber and soldiers. North Africa provided wheat, phosphates, and again, countless fighting men. The war drained the metropole, but the empire acted as a vital, if exploited, reservoir of strength. The experience of World War I was a profound turning point for the French Empire, though its full impact wouldn't be felt for decades. Colonial soldiers and labourers who survived the war returned home with a changed perspective. They had seen Europe fought alongside Frenchmen and witnessed the vulnerability of their colonial masters. They had been promised recognition, respect, and sometimes even greater rights or autonomy in exchange for their sacrifice. But often, those promises proved hollow. The idea that civilized Europeans could descend into such barbarity among themselves also shattered any remaining illusions about the moral superiority of the colonial project. The war ignited a nascent anti-colonial consciousness, giving rise to new leaders and movements who questioned the very legitimacy of French rule. The interwar period, the 1920s and 1930s, is often romanticized as the zenith of the French Empire. On paper, it was at its largest, covering an astonishing 12.3 million square kilometers and encompassing over 110 million people. French prestige, momentarily tarnished by the war's horrors, was propped up by grand colonial exhibitions, most notably the 1931 Exposition Coloniale Internationale in Paris. This was a spectacle, a monumental propaganda effort designed to showcase the supposed benefits and grandeur of the empire to the French public and the world. Recreations of exotic villages, displays of colonial products, and parades of, quote, 51 peoples were all meant to foster a sense of pride and justify the continued exploitation. Quote, 52 proclaimed one exhibit, a sister, perhaps, but one who demanded unwavering obedience and constant tribute. Economically, the empire continued to serve as a protected market for French industries and a reliable source of raw materials. French businesses thrived, shielded from international competition within the imperial system. Culturally, French language and education continued to spread, creating a thin veneer of French influence over diverse local cultures. But beneath this glittering facade, the contradictions deepened. France, a republic founded on the principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity, found itself increasingly grappling with the moral and political inconsistencies of maintaining a vast autocratic empire. The rise of fascism in Europe, with its overt racial ideologies and expansionist ambitions, ironically made some French thinkers more defensive of their mission civilisatrice, portraying it as a more benevolent alternative. Yet the reality on the ground was often one of brutal suppression of dissent, economic exploitation, and a rigid racial hierarchy that denied colonial subjects the very rights and dignities enjoyed by citizens in the metropole. Nationalist movements, though still relatively small and often suppressed, gained traction. Figures like Ho Chi Minh, a young Vietnamese nationalist, were already active, drawing inspiration from both Western liberal thought and Soviet communism. In North Africa, movements for greater autonomy and independence began to coalesce. The promise of self-determination, championed by American President Woodrow Wilson after WWI, resonated deeply in the colonies, challenging the very foundations of imperial rule. France, however, largely remained oblivious or dismissive of these growing rumblings. Its primary focus, still reeling from the scars of WWI, was on continental security, epitomized by the construction of the Maginot Line, a defensive mindset that prioritized the borders of the metropole above all else. This insular focus meant that the long-term stability and inherent injustices of the empire were often overlooked, or simply deemed too complex to address. The empire was seen as a source of strength, a strategic asset, a symbol of national power, rather than a system teetering on the brink of significant upheaval. Yet, even as the empire reached its physical peak, the ground beneath it was beginning to shift. The seeds of revolution, sown by the hypocrisy of the mission civilisatrice and fertilized by the blood and sacrifice of 2 world wars, were quietly germinating. The stage was set for another global conflict, one that would irrevocably alter the course of the French Empire and ignite the fires of decolonization. We left France, a nation supposedly victorious in the, quote, 53, quote, standing at the apex of its territorial empire, yet simultaneously teetering on the precipice of profound internal and imperial contradictions. Think about it. Millions of colonial subjects had bled for France, fighting in the mud of the Western Front, enduring the searing heat of distant campaigns, believing, or perhaps desperately hoping, that their sacrifice would earn them a measure of dignity, respect, or even, dare we say it, equality. But did it? Of course not. This is France we're talking about, a nation whose very identity since 1789 was supposedly forged in the fires of liberty, equality, and fraternity. And yet, its empire, its vast global network of territories, was anything but. The interwar period, that deceptively quiet stretch between 1918 and 1939, was a slow-motion unravelling for the French Empire. On the surface, it projected an image of immense power and reach, a grand mission civilisatrice, bringing progress to the uncivilized corners of the globe. The 1931 colonial exhibition in Paris, a dazzling spectacle of reconstructed temples, ethnographic villages, and exotic goods, was designed to hammer this point home. Millions flocked to see it, marvelling at the sheer scale of France's dominion, a testament to its supposed greatness. But beneath this glittering facade, a different story was being written. A story of unfulfilled promises, simmering resentment, and the inexorable rise of anti-colonial sentiment. France itself, despite its victory, was exhausted. The demographic toll of World War I was catastrophic, a generation decimated. Its economy, while recovering, was fragile, and its political landscape under the Third Republic was a merry-go-round of short-lived governments and parliamentary instability. The empire, therefore, became more than just a source of raw materials or a captive market. It became a psychological crutch, a visible manifestation of France's continued relevance on the world stage, a balm for a nation deeply scarred. We needed the empire, or at least the idea of it, to feel strong again. But this need only intensified the exploitation. From the scorching deserts of North Africa to the lush deltas of Indochina, the French colonial administration tightened its grip. The infamous indigenous system, particularly prevalent in Algeria and other parts of the empire, codified a separate, inferior legal status for indigenous populations. It meant arbitrary arrests, forced labour, collective punishments, and a complete denial of basic civil liberties. Imagine living under a system where a French administrator, a mere district chief, could sentence you to jail or forced labour without trial, simply for disrespect or failing to pay a tax. This wasn't some abstract legal theory. It was the daily, brutal reality for millions. The colonies were expected to contribute to France's economic recovery, and they did, often at immense human cost. Raw materials, rubber from Indochina, phosphates from Tunisia, groundnuts from West Africa, minerals from Congo, were extracted with ruthless efficiency, cash crops, grown for export to metropolitan France, often replaced subsistence farming, leaving local populations vulnerable to famines and market fluctuations, particularly when the Great Depression hit. We talk about the Depression in Europe and America, but rarely do we consider its devastating impact on colonial economies, which were entirely subservient to the metropole. Prices for raw materials collapsed, exacerbating poverty and hardship, and fueling a deeper sense of injustice. The mission civilisatrice, the supposed justification for all this, rang increasingly hollow. France promised to bring education, healthcare, and modernity, but the reality was often a handful of schools for an entire region, rudimentary medical facilities, and infrastructure built primarily to facilitate resource extraction, not local development. Assimilation, the idea that colonial subjects could become French if they adopted French language and culture, was a cruel mirage. Even the most educated and francophile elites found themselves hitting a glass ceiling, forever treated as second-class citizens in their own lands. They might speak perfect French, quote Voltaire, and serve in the French army, but they would never truly be French. This hypocrisy, this stark contrast between the ideals France championed for itself and the realities it imposed on its empire, was the fertile ground in which nationalism began to bloom. The seeds had been sown before the war, but the experience of fighting in it, of seeing Europeans kill each other in truly barbaric fashion, of serving alongside Frenchmen and realizing they were not inherently superior, profoundly changed perspectives. Colonial veterans, many of whom had fought with distinction, returned home expecting recognition, perhaps even citizenship. What they found instead was continued discrimination, economic hardship, and the reinforcement of their subordinate status. "We fought for France," they would say, "but France does not fight for us." This disillusionment wasn't confined to veterans. Intellectuals, often educated in French schools, began to articulate the injustices of the colonial system. Ho Chi Minh, the young Vietnamese nationalist we briefly encountered, was just one example. He had gone to Versailles in 1919, hoping to appeal to Woodrow Wilson's principles of self-determination, only to be ignored. His path, and the path of many others, increasingly turned towards more radical ideologies, notably communism, which offered a powerful framework for understanding and resisting colonial exploitation. Across North Africa, the stirrings of organized nationalism grew louder. In Algeria, the Étoile Nord-Africaine, founded by Messali Hadj, began advocating for Algerian independence, a truly audacious demand in a territory France considered an integral part of itself. In Tunisia, the Destor Party pushed for greater autonomy and constitutional reforms. In Morocco, the Istiqlal Independence Party would emerge, challenging French protectorate rule. These movements weren't monolithic. They often had different visions for the future, ranging from greater rights within the French framework to complete independence. But they all shared a common thread: a rejection of French domination and a demand for self-determination. Even in West Africa, where French control was arguably less challenged in this period, cultural associations began to form, ostensibly for social or religious purposes, but often serving as nascent platforms for political awakening. The shared experience of French administration, the imposition of French language and education, ironically created a sense of Pan-African identity among some elites, who started to question the legitimacy of foreign rule. France's response was, for the most part, a mixture of repression and paternalistic denial. Any serious challenge to its authority was met with force. Nationalist leaders were arrested, exiled, or suppressed. Yet, there were also moments of fleeting, almost performative reform. The Blum-Violette proposal in the mid-1930s, for instance, aimed to grant a limited number of Algerian Muslims French citizenship, a tiny fraction of the population, and even that was met with such fierce opposition from the European settlers in Algeria that ultimately failed. It was too little, too late, and revealed the deep-seated racism and intransigence within the colonial system. As the 1930s drew to a close, the illusion of French imperial stability was increasingly difficult to maintain. The global economic downturn, the growing assertiveness of nationalist movements, and the sheer moral bankruptcy of the mission civilisatrice were chipping away at the foundations. And then, the storm clouds gathered again over Europe. The rise of Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan signalled another global conflict was inevitable. France, still reeling from the last war, would once again look to its empire for strength. It would need its resources, its strategic locations, and most crucially, its manpower. Millions more colonial subjects would be called upon to fight and die for a France that continued to deny them their fundamental rights. This, we must understand, was the ultimate paradox: a nation that championed liberty and equality at home, yet depended on a vast exploitative empire to survive. The coming war would not only test France's resolve, but would accelerate the very forces that would ultimately dismantle its global dominion. The empire, which had once seemed so mighty and eternal at the 1931 exhibition, was about to face its greatest challenge yet, and the seeds of its destruction were already deeply sown within its own soil.